is about developing our spiritual core. It's sort of like what the song says right now. There's a rainbow. There's always a rainbow over your head. How do we walk in the world with that understanding, with that knowing? How do we transfer that to our unity perspective? How do we walk in the world knowing that we carry the Almighty Spirit in us, as us, moving through the world? And that takes practice. The world always seems to be in chaos. Does anyone feel like the world? I hear people like, ooh, Stephanie said, ooh. Right? It always feels like the world is in chaos. I'm like, are you serious? We're still coming out of this pandemic. Y'all want to have worn out? Anybody feel that way? Yes. It's amazing. But how do we see the world that's in fear and chaos and not let it shake us to our core? How do we address conflict and change from a place of spiritual strength? So this month we're going to explore how do we develop this thing called our spiritual core, which is that deep reservoir of strength that can source us and resource us in tough times. So the inspiration, the kind of metaphysical soup we got going here, this whole spiritual soup we got going here, is partly from what we have this month. It's Women's History Month. Did you know that March is Women's History Month? We get to play with this idea of women's strength and women's history and women's power. Of course, we have the 12th power, which is strength. And we also, just this past Wednesday, moved into Lent. So we're in the season of Lent until Easter, which is about, for the unity perspective, it's about feasting and fasting. So we're fasting from those thoughts in our minds that are holding us back from our truth. The thoughts, the words, the actions that are holding us back from fully inhabiting our spiritual selves. And we're feasting on things that give us life, that give us energy, that give us strength. So we're going to be playing with all that. Today we're going to be focusing on this concept of spiritual strength. Now before, I want to give you all some working definitions, because I think it's helpful to just have definitions about what we're talking about. So one psychologist says that about spiritual strength, she says this: people who have the ability to draw from something outside of self, a belief in God or some form of the spiritual, and those who meditate, pray, and are awed by nature seem to cope better. They seem to possess a particular inner strength that acknowledges limits but reaches beyond the self. What they cannot muster for themselves, they are able to draw from the external, joining their inherent strength with the divine, the universe, nature, the bigger self. With a spiritual core comes faith that things larger than ourselves are possible, and that this also includes solutions. Now, from a unity perspective, some of that is true, but we add some additional kind of information to that, where we're bringing to this spiritual party what we have from the inside. What is happening from within, that divine inheritance that we have, those innate spiritual powers to stand in our strength, to stand in our powers and deal with the material, and not just deal with it, but transform it. Therein lies the crux of what these teachings present. It's not just looking at them, reframing them, it's literally transforming them so that the world becomes a new, brighter, better, interesting, wondrous world. Those of you who work out, right, I'm going to kind of give you also to start thinking about this. If you work out and you find yourself maybe not having a certain balance in an activity, not having the ability to do things, has anyone ever found out? What have people told you? Anybody know? Your core needs to be, who I see workers out, yeah, I don't want to do those sit-ups. I don't want to do those crunches. But it's interesting when we think about physically this idea of the core. It sustains the entire physical structure. The core helps with balance. It helps with being able to stabilize your entire body. But I once, but still do, have issues with my neck and shoulders. And all the specialists that I've been to say the same thing. Work your core. Still getting that one together. But anyway, that's another sermon. But we work our spiritual core in the same way. Our spiritual core is that thing that is within us that we're building, that we're practicing. We're not going to go and decide that we're going to do, some really elaborate move, right? Or even run a marathon without that training, without that practice, without that building of that muscle. And so spiritual core is the same way. We're practicing daily. We're doing all of these things daily to be able to build that muscle so that when we need it, it's going to help us. It's going to move us to the next level. It's going to save us, literally. I remember a story, and this is kind of random, but it just came to me. Years ago, singer Gloria Estefan was in a massive accident when she was on tour. Does anybody remember that? She was in a massive accident with a bus, and the thing that saved her was the fact that she had been really conditioning her body for the tour. So she had been working out a lot, and in particular, because she had such a strong core, even though I think her back was broken, she actually fully recovered and healed. This is the same way for us as spirited beings, as truth students, that when we're building daily, what we're doing is building for that moment when we need it. In Chinese medicine, it's the same. The spiritual core is here. And what you're doing is you're collecting that chi here. You're sourcing from that chi here to be able to, when you need it, to be able to do what the situation calls. Very similar. Building our spiritual core, because the core becomes that catalyst to your physical and emotional well-being as well. I want to take a little tour here right now to a story in the Bible that I think is so, it illustrates what I want us to kind of gather here today and understand and kind of feel into today. And it's from the book of Esther. Has anyone ever read the book of Esther here? Okay, I've got a few folks. So the book of Esther is only one of two books in the Bible that are named for women. And it's also one of, I believe, only two, very few, books in the Bible that never name God. The word God, Spirit, nothing that talks about this power is ever named in this book. Now, I'm going to try to give you the condensed sort of summary, because it's a long, not a long book, but it is kind of an intricate and interesting story. But the idea of this, I want to share with you how this story came to me, because I think it's sort of important that I share that. I grew up, as I've mentioned before, a Catholic, and we really don't read the Bible, at least not in my spiritual tradition. So I had never read the Bible. And, those of you who've gone to Catholic church know that it tends to be on a cycle, what the priests read and what is shared and yada yada. So I'd never heard of this book, and it was only by accident, right? Spiritual accident, that this came to me. I had just started ministerial school at the time, and I went to a spiritual retreat for women. And I was in a workshop where there was about 5 women that were there. And we were talking about, I don't know, whatever the theme was. And in the middle of all of this woman just starts sobbing. Just sobbing, like that ugly cry, that snot cry. You don't know those cries? Yeah, she was just in so much pain. And of course, we had to stop and say what was happening. We had to address what was happening. So she started sharing with us her story and said how she had come out to her family as a lesbian. That she had not only come out to her family, but she had also married her partner. And as a result of this, her family completely ostracized her. Her son said awful things to her that no one who loves you should ever say, about being disgusting, about being, yada yada, right? Her father, her mother, her siblings, everyone did not embrace her. And on top of that, the only person who had attempted to engage her or embrace this or kind of understand this was her father, and he had recently died. So in all of this emotion, this woman is coming to this retreat, and she's in deep pain because she was so close to her family, so close to her father, and just really wanted to stand in her truth, but also didn't want to lose her life. So in that, one of the women said, let's just read something from the Bible. Have you all ever just cracked open the Bible? I have never done that, where it's just like, let's see what Spirit gives us today. And so I think it was, I don't know if it was me or who, I guess it actually was me. I just opened it up, and guess what book I opened up to? Esther. True story, people. I cannot make this stuff up. Esther is the story of a woman who has to stand in her truth. It's a woman who has been hiding her identity for years. She is a woman who is a Jew, who is of Hebrew background, who then has to hide herself because at that time they were persecuted. And she has to hide that until the point where she decides, I am going to speak my truth. So this is kind of the interesting thing we come to this. I want you to hold that sort of story for a second, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Esther. So the story begins where there is a king, and the king's name is Ahasuerus. And he is a Persian king, very powerful, very mighty. They talk about in the Bible, he has sort of 127 kingdoms from India to, I forget where, it's vast. He's very powerful. And he has a queen named Vashti. And as we know, kings have a tendency, had a tendency to do, or maybe have still. They like the good life, they like the boisterous, excessive life, and so he's having this party. And he's drunk. It's a party that goes on for days. And after numerous days and all this wantonness and drunkenness, he sends for his wife Vashti, and he says, I want to show her beauty. Now, it's interpreted in many ways. Some people say he was calling her to actually have her stand naked so that all of these other men, he could prove to them how beautiful she was. Others have just said, in the culture at the time, it was inappropriate for a woman to be seen. They were kept in hiding, and other men, certainly, even if they were fully clothed, were not to be able to see them. They were not, that was a dishonor to them. So when he calls her, she refuses. She refuses to come. Now, he's the king, and he is also her husband, and in that time, you didn't refuse the king. So she decides she's going to do this. What ends up happening, we don't really fully know in the Bible. Does he kill her? Does he? Many stories. But the fact remains that he creates this whole situation, this whole decree around what happens. And I'm going to share a little bit about that. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, conveyed by the eunuchs? Then it said, not only the queen has done wrong to the king, but to all the officials and all the people who are in the provinces of the king. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, well, the king commanded the queen to be brought before him, and she didn't come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end to the contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never to come again to give her royal position, never to come again before the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So here we have the queen. She's shuttled away. So then the king decides he wants to figure out, I need another queen. He goes on this massive search. And in this search, Esther presents herself. So step forward, Esther. Make a long story short, he ends up catching his attention. He ends up making her queen. But all of this happens with her being silent about who she really is. She was not abandoned, she was left fostered. Her parents died, and she was fostered by an uncle, Mordecai. And Mordecai was sort of that male elder that tried to help her out, that also, at some level in those times, was very controlling about who she was and how she was to be. So he presents her to the king, and she goes in, and yada yada, he gets favor, and she becomes the queen. But he's also part of this picture, this puzzle. What ends up happening slowly is that the second in command to the king, Haman, is very against Jews and decides that he wants to exterminate them all. So he convinces the king that they are to be all killed, women, children, men, everyone. So in all of this situation, now Esther stands and has to make a decision. Do I keep my comfort in life? Do I keep this? I've got all of these people. I've got all of this food, all of this jewelry, all of these perfumes, all of this life that is abundant and rich and blessed. Do I keep that life, or do I speak up to the truth of who I am? To make a long story short, she ends up deciding to speak up. And she does it very interesting. She does it in a very subtle way. She does it in a way that is metered out. She ends up having 2 different banquets or feasts for the king where she's kind of priming him. Even the very act of her going to him when she went to invite him to the first feast was an act of sedition in many ways. It was an act, nobody goes to the king without being summoned. And she said, I need to go to the king. I need to have to do this. So she goes to him, and luckily he does call her forth. That saves her. If she hadn't been called forth, that would have meant her death, because nobody comes to the king without being asked. But she dares to come, and then she dares to ask him to dinner. And she also asked this other man, Haman. Again, I'm going to fast forward. You all need to read the story. But what ends up happening is she ends up disclosing to the king the fact that she is a Jew. She ends up disclosing to the king the fact that Haman has set this plan in motion, not only to want to kill her as a Jew, but her people. And she asks and implores the king to be able to save her people and to not have this plan come to fruition. So he ends up agreeing. Haman ends up being killed, and all of this other stuff ends up ensuing. But the biggest part of the story is the fact that she stands in her truth. She stands and speaks who she is. If we look at this metaphysically, Charles Fillmore says that Esther means hidden. Her name itself means hidden, and even hidden from God. What do we understand that to mean? She's hiding, but at the same time, God is never mentioned. So we get the understanding that where is God showing up in that story? God is showing up in that story through her. She is the voice, she is the hands, she is the justice, she is the faith of God in that story, because she's coming from that hidden place. Originally, it says in the Bible that her name was Hadassah. And Hadassah comes from the word Hadass, which is a myrtle tree. It is strong, but it also has this beautiful scent, this beautiful fragrance that is both strong and yet allows it to be embraced. It's also known in ancient times as a tree of righteousness. So we have all of this information here of this story. All of this is happening. According to the Kabbalah, each of her names correspond to a different spiritual level. So we too, all of us here, can connect to that idea, the transcendent levels of godness or godliness with our world when we choose to engage our strength and do something righteous. We choose to engage our strength instead of living in fear, or living in ego, or living in the past. We choose strength to do something different. In the story, she's also fasting, and that's another important part. We're in this time of Lent, and in the tradition that we see in Christianity for Jesus and what Jesus did in terms of fasting, to kind of get connected, to get to the wisdom, to connect to that inner self, there was periods of fasting. And so for us, it could be in Unity, people do literally fast, right? You don't eat, you don't drink, or you do different versions of what fasting means to you. But fasting, from a metaphysical sense, is letting go of the blocks in our mind. Letting go of the toxic ideas that we're carrying with us, and instead feasting, creating the space like Esther did to feast for our truth to be lifted out and forward into the world victoriously. Feasting and fasting. I want us to think, a few minutes that we have left, I want us to think about this idea. The Bible stories seem interesting. They bring us to information. But think about what it was to be a woman in that time and be in this situation where you were completely controlled by men. You were didn't have any rights. You didn't have any say-so. Everything you did, you ate, you wore, how you were, what you said, what you didn't say, it was completely controlled. So both Queen Vashti, and Esther use their position as women to be able to claim the truth of their being as spiritual beings. There are wonderful examples in the story of how we can think about what we need to do when we move forward in our lives. Does it mean saying, no, I take it no more? Does it mean having patience, creating a plan, waiting it out? Does it mean stepping forward and saying, this is me, I want a new job, I want a new relationship, I want time for myself, I want to go back to my art, whatever that is. How is it that we're taking these stories and making them part of our own spiritual journey? It's not about these stories that happened. It's about what's happening within us and how we can connect to that and the blueprints that we're given through these stories. So I'm going to offer us a time now to practice. How do we practice strength here? Because all of these examples are how strength, when they're in their stories, Esther and Vashti, we don't hear the background, we don't hear the history, but they're developing their spiritual core every day. Every time they're told something, they're waiting for that moment. They're waiting for that time. They're building, connecting with Source, connecting with Spirit to know when it's right to do what they're called to do. Just like the young woman who came to me in that workshop crying. So let's take this into a time of meditation. We invite our musician up here, David. And I'm going to do something a little different here today. We're talking about strength. And strength is physical in many ways, right? So I'm going to invite people who can stand and who want to stand. If you don't want to, that's okay too. This is all your journey. So those who would like to stand and do this meditation, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to ask you to rise. And maybe if you need to hold on to the pew in front of you, only if you can. Don't feel obligated. You can do this seated. Take some beautiful, deep, cleansing breaths. Maybe you want to close your eyes. I have a hard time closing my eyes when I'm standing, but maybe you hold on to someone or something, the pew in front of you. Maybe you want to close your eyes and relax. Allow yourself to just breathe and be in this moment. And I'm going to share with you an adapted version of a meditation by Charles Fillmore that he did just like this standing in 1923. So I invite everyone to feel into what it means to be perfectly free. Allow your body to just relax into this moment. Your mind, your heart, and your spiritual core to come online and feel what it feels like to be spiritually free. Relax that mind in order for the spirit to step up, to step out. This gives us the receptive state of mind. And we realize now in this moment that great principle of strength in which we live and move and have our being. God is the strength of my life. Say it aloud with me. God is the strength of my life. And now say it silently. God is the strength of my life. God is the strength of my life. No matter what is happening to me, to my body, no matter what is happening outside in the environment, no matter what is happening in my home, in my church, in my material world, God is the strength of my life. And now I want you to send that thought to the small of your back. Allow that thought to literally source and resource that small of your back. God is the strength of my life. Now let that consciousness of that strength go into your legs. Let those legs be vitalized and revitalized, every cell teeming with this strength. God is the strength of my life. Now go to your throat. We're going to go up. Power center, where we speak our truth into existence, where we say who we are, what we are about, and who we need to be in this world. Feel that throat. God is the strength of my life. That throat nerve connects that nerve in your power center of strength. God is the strength of my life. All power is given unto me. Let it be. Amen. You may be seated. God is the strength of my life. We move forward today remembering the story of Esther, remembering the strength. Esther chapter 4 verse 14, she's told by Mordecai, her uncle, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. So we move forward today, and when things happen, remember, God has sourced you to be in this for just a time as this. No matter what is happening, God has brought you to this moment for such a time as this. There are no accidents. All is in divine order.